1st Congressional District and Mr. Simpliski from New York's 23rd Congressional District to the committee. Does the ranking member wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Unfortunately, Mr. Finstead was not able to make it again this morning, but Mr. Sempolinski is being a great role model for a committee member and showing up 2 days in a row.
Good. Do you have a motion to make on subcommittees?
Yes, sir. I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Finstead of Minnesota be appointed to the Subcommittee on Higher Ed and Workforce Investment. Further, I ask that Mr. Sempolinski of New York be appointed to Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education.
Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. Does Mr. Sempolinski wish to say a few words?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I'm extremely proud to have been selected to serve on the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Ed Subcommittee. This subcommittee has got an important duty to ensure that our children are getting the very best education they can. As a husband to a teacher and someone who's worked in a parochial school, I understand and appreciate the vital role that the education system plays in our society. But most importantly, I come to this subcommittee as a parent. I believe this subcommittee is a place where my office can do a lot of good for the people of the 23rd District of New York and the country as a whole. The work of this subcommittee in particular is more important than ever. America's students are in crisis coming out of the COVID lockdowns, and America's parents are under attack for standing up for their children. On this subcommittee, we must work to remedy the harmful effects of the lockdowns and find a path forward out of this crisis. It's also important to state that parents should never be put down or criticized for wanting to do what they believe is very best for their children. I want to make sure that parents have a voice in their children's education, and education is about instruction, not indoctrination. It is our duty to ensure that we are working day and night to fix any and all problems in our education system. We owe it to our children. I also want to take a moment to say how honored I am to serve on the full committee. I had a great time yesterday at the hearing for my first hearing, and I also want to say thank you to the ranking member who has been so friendly and accommodating to me. She came up to me on the floor just prior to my swearing in, sat down with me and talked about the committee's business, and she's been just wonderful to me. You know, America's children and its workforce and its job creators are the backbone of society. I see it daily in my district. The men and women whose work ethic and entrepreneurial spirit make this country great, and the children that are our future. As I serve on this committee and on the subcommittee to which I've been assigned, I will always have their best interests and concerns on my mind, and I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you. That concludes the business portion of the meeting, and we're ready to begin the markup, and I'll count down from 5, and we'll begin the markup. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The committee will please come to order. A quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.Res. 1295 of inquiry directing the Secretary of Education to submit certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the Department of Education's cost estimates for the Secretary's waivers related to public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment. H.Res. 1296 of inquiry requesting the President and directing the Secretary of Education to transmit respectively certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the legal authority to forgive federal student loan debt. And finally, H.Res. 1273 of inquiry directing the President to provide certain documents in the President's possession to the House of Representatives relating to communications between the executive branch and the American Federation of Teachers regarding reopening schools and supporting safe in-person learning. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11 of the House Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 1, the chair may recess the committee at any point. Should the chair need to step aside for any reason, another majority member of the committee is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. This is a hybrid markup pursuant to House Resolution 8 and the regulations thereto, and all microphones in the committee room and the remote platform will be kept muted to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. When members wish to speak or seek recognition, they should unmute themselves and allow a pause of 2 seconds to ensure the microphone picks up their speech. I also ask members to please identify themselves before they speak. Members who are participating in person should not be logged on to the remote platform in order to avoid background noises, feedback, echoes, and distortion. Members participating remotely shall be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this is if they're experiencing technical difficulties and inform the committee staff of such difficulty. However, members must be visible on camera to count toward a quorum and to vote. And the rules allow no exception to that. For all members, there needs to be a verbal vote so that the clerk and the official stenographer reporter can hear it. A thumbs up or a thumbs down without a verbal vote will not suffice. Further, all members, whether participating in person or remotely, should state their names when casting a roll call vote. This helps the clerk and also helps those watching on the platform and live stream who may be experiencing a few seconds delay. Any member participating remotely experiences technical difficulties during the meeting, you should stay connected to the platform, make sure you are muted, and use your phone immediately to call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Amendments must be submitted electronically to the amendment repository pursuant to the instructions in the notice of amendment process that was distributed to all committee offices by the clerk with the markup notice. Amendments must be submitted to the repository before they are offered at markup. Members are encouraged to have an electronic device dedicated to reviewing amendments. Paper copies will not be distributed. In order to ensure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's digital timer on the remote platform. For members participating in person, the timer will be broadcast in the committee room on a large television monitor at the back of the room across from the members as part of the platform gallery view and visible in its own thumbnail window. The committee room timer will not be in use. For members participating remotely, this will be visible in gallery view in its own thumbnail window on the remote platform. Members are asked to wrap up promptly when their time has expired. Finally, while there's recent guidance from the Office of Attending Physician has made mask wearing optional, at this time, we still recommend masks because we have in our midst people who may be immunocompromised or for any reason not vaccinated. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. Today we're meeting to mark up 3 resolutions of inquiry, or ROIs, a tool used to conduct oversight. Committee Democrats take this very seriously, take very seriously our responsibility to conduct oversight and view our work as critical constitutional function of Congress. To that end, the committee has held 16 oversight hearings during the 117th Congress, in which included nearly 50 hours of hearing with several Biden-Harris administration officials, such as the Secretary of Education, Undersecretary of Department of Education, Chief Operating Officer of the Office of Federal Student Aid, and many others. The role of congressional oversight sits squarely with the committee's chair and the majority party. According to the Congressional Research Service, quote, no judicial precedent has directly recognizes a right in an individual member other than a committee chair to exercise a committee's oversight authority without the permission of a majority of the committee or its chair, unquote. Even still, as I understand, the Biden-Harris administration has been responsive to letters from the minority. The administration has not only responded to letters sent by the minority, but it's also met with minority staff on multiple occasions to address their inquiries. And let's contrast that with the previous administration. Within the first 6 months of former President Trump's term, it was publicly reported that White House lawyers had directed the executive departments to completely ignore oversight requests from congressional Democrats. When Democrats took the majority in the House in 2019, the majority committee staff was vested with the congressional oversight authority I referred to earlier, and we still faced unprecedented stonewalling from the administration to responding to committee inquiries. So let's be clear, despite having no requirement or recent precedent to do so, the Biden-Harris administration has been responsive to oversight requests from the minority. And simply because you do not like an answer you received does not mean the department was unresponsive. Moreover, even if the minority did have a legitimate role in conducting oversight, the breadth and scope of the ROIs before us are excessive. So I urge my colleagues to move these ROIs expeditiously this morning so that we can return to the committee's work to help students, workers, and families succeed. And now I'm pleased to recognize and yield to the distinguished ranking member from North Carolina, Dr. Fox, for her opening statement. Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Democrats want unfettered control over our education system from kindergarten to college, and they'll use every avenue to achieve their desired end goal. We must resist this state-sponsored indoctrination campaign. When the executive branch oversteps its bounds, the only appropriate response is holding it to account. From encouraging school shutdowns to enacting retroactive free college, the executive branch has broken free of its leash. That's precisely what why Republicans have introduced 3 separate resolutions of inquiry. The requested documents in these resolutions are integral to oversight authorities of this committee, and the American people deserve a transparent government. We will first consider 2 post-secondary education-related resolutions. H.Res 1295 demands the Biden administration provide cost estimates for its changes to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program and the Income-Driven Repayment Program. This is not something we should have to ask for. The Biden administration should be forthcoming with these numbers instead of trying to hide them from taxpayers. President Biden is making radical changes to the student loan program through executive fiat and must be held accountable. These programs are already costing taxpayers billions more than originally estimated, but these changes will increase costs exponentially. The documents we've requested will help us understand what the true cost of Biden's unilateral actions will be, what estimates the administration used to make the decision to erase these debts owed to the taxpayer, and what the impacts are to taxpayers. We will also consider H.Res 1296, which directs the Biden administration to provide documents related to the administration's legal authority to transfer federal student loans to taxpayers. The Biden administration's student loan bailout is an illegal power grab. Even Nancy Pelosi argued that President Biden does not have the authority to cancel student loans. This $500 billion wealth transfer from hardworking taxpayers will cost taxpayers at least $2,500 each and exacerbate Biden's inflation crisis. These kinds of fiscally irresponsible measures are the last thing our country needs. Biden's student loan debt scheme will make our broken post-secondary education system even worse. It will set the precedent for politically driven loan cancellation, which encourages students to borrow as much as possible because they expect taxpayers to foot the bill. It will also encourage colleges and universities to continue increasing the cost of overvalued degrees that do not lead to a return on investment. This move by the Biden administration will have cascading consequences, ones that will affect generations of students to come. Those in the Biden administration should ask themselves whether buying a few votes before the midterms is worth the cost. To conduct proper oversight, we need to know who the administration met with, did those with conflicts participate in the meetings, and were there other legal opinions the administration considered. Lastly, we will consider H.Res 1273, which directs the Biden administration to provide documents relating to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky's decision to change school reopening guidelines at the behest of the American Federation of Teachers president, Randy Weingarten. Collusion between America's most powerful teachers' unions and the CDC is a blight upon the educational pursuits of American children. Instead of relying on science and statistical evidence, Dr. Walensky changed school opening guidelines to appease the administration's political allies. Let me be abundantly clear. Teachers' unions should never be allowed to hold schools hostage again. The consequences of prolonged school closures have been expansive and severe, most notably in the realm of academic performance. Over half of public school teachers admitted school closures have caused significant learning loss for teachers. According to the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress report, reading and math scores plummeted during the pandemic. In fact, 9-year-olds lost 20 years of academic progress, meaning children today are posting the same test scores in reading and math as children did 2 decades ago. It's evident that this administration and this Democrat majority have failed our nation's children. The last time I checked, that's not something you hang your hat on. Students must be put first. Full transparency from the Biden administration about its imprudent decisions that harm so many students is essential. I hope my colleagues will join us in supporting these resolutions, since the documents being requested today will bring transparency to Congress and the American people. I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the printing clerk electronically by the end of the day. House rules require a copy of the measures under consideration be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. This was done, and materials were distributed to all committee offices by the clerk. The first bill that we will consider, the committee will now proceed with the consideration of the resolution H.Res 1295. The clerk will designate the resolution.
H.Res 1295 of inquiry directing the Secretary of Education to transmit certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the Department of Education's cost estimates for the Secretary's waivers related to public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. And without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.Res 1295 offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Without objection, this amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute was distributed electronically in advance. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute to make a small technical edit to the bill, and it would technically allow us to debate the substitute. As we begin debate on the resolution of inquiry, I'd like to once again remind friends on the other side that, quote, no judicial precedent has directly recognized the right of an individual member other than the committee chair to exercise the committee's oversight authority without the permission of a majority of the committee or its chair. And those are not my words, but the words of the Congressional Research Service. So as such, as my friends would like to consider these resolutions as oversight, that's not actually what's going on. Multiple members in the minority, including the ranking member, are on record expressing their dislike for the public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment programs. In the past, when they held the gavel on this committee, they championed legislation that would end public service loan forgiveness for new borrowers and reduce all income-based loan repayment options to one plan, less generous than the income-based repayment plans presently offered. And now, faced with the president and administration who have sought to use their authority to, whenever possible, to ease the burden of student debt on hardworking, taxpaying Americans and their families, we're using the resolution which will have the effect to bog down the administration with extraordinary production requests in the name of oversight. They have referenced unanswered requests to the department that again hold no authority under House rules as a reason to bring forth a resolution that will slow down the good work of this administration. But procedure aside, let's look at the underlying substance, because it appears that what is requested is a cost estimate of these initiatives. I'll point out that because no one can actually know precisely what the cost will be without knowing who's going to avail themselves of the programs, but the GAO has offered a cost estimate, $9.5 billion as of May 2022. And so we already know what the cost is. And furthermore, the Office of Student Aid is mandated by federal law, the Higher Education Act, among others, to produce to Congress an accounting of all of its program activities. So we will soon be getting an updated version from the Department of Education for this estimate. The Department of Education is currently providing actual live data reflecting how many loans and how much debt the PSLF waivers are relieving for students, and they're doing that every month. Once again, the ROI goes much further than just asking for cost estimates, and that's the reason that we need to allow the information to come as it's coming. H.Res 1295, if passed by the House, would require the department to produce staff notes, emails, records of informal meetings, and everything else the department staff may have, meetings that they may have had with academics, even members of Congress, anything vaguely related to the cost of these programs. It will have the effect of bogging down the administration with complying with production, especially unreasonable since we already know the cost estimates that are at the heart of the request provided by the GAO and forthcoming from the department. So I'd ask my colleagues to support the amendment of nature substitute and to support a motion to report the resolution to the House unfavorably. I yield back. Does anyone seek recognition?
Mr.
Does
Chair.
anyone seek recognition? Who's speaking?
Mr. Chair. This
I'm
is
sorry, I can't-
Representative Miller Meeks.
Ms. Miller Meeks, you're recognized for 5 minutes, is the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Biden administration is making radical changes to student loan repayment programs without the consent of Congress and thus without the consent of the American people. Let me remind all of us that it's the American people who pay for loan forgiveness, not the administration. President Biden is relying on executive fiat to expand and bend the income-driven repayment, IDR, and the public service loan forgiveness, PSLF, programs through waivers. H.Res. 1295 is essential to holding the administration accountable for these changes. The department must be transparent about the anticipated cost and the impact of the IDR and PSLF waivers. What Democrats won't mention when talking about the supposed need for expanding these programs is how much they're already costing taxpayers. In fact, the cost of these programs has been underestimated for years. According to a recent Government Accountability Office report, the Department of Education's budget for student loans was off by $311 billion over the last 20 years. Whether this massive miscalculation was intentional or not, the taxpayers are footing the bill, and they deserve answers. We do know that this budget mistake is due in large part to incorrect assumptions about the IDR and the PSLF programs. Yet this didn't stop the Biden administration from issuing waivers expanding these programs well beyond what Congress intended, for giving as much as an estimated $211 billion for the IDR waiver alone. Moreover, while the Biden administration refuses to provide taxpayers with a cost estimate, outside experts, including economists at the University of Virginia, estimate that the PSLF waiver could erase as much as $145 billion in debt. It's time to call these actions what they are: retroactive free college. The PSLF program is a bailout for Georgetown lawyers and doctors earning six figures. Under this program, 1/4 of professionals qualify for loan cancellation, and 1/3 of PSLF borrowers are earning over six figures. This means taxpayers, many of whom have never gone to college, will be the ones on the hook to pay for the loans of those who have a higher income than them. This is the definition of a reverse Robin Hood. In addition, it doesn't get to the crux of the problem, which is the high cost of tuition and how do colleges and universities lower cost of tuition. The House of Representatives should expect and demand full transparency from the Biden administration about its decisions that will likely cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. This oversight is core responsibility of this committee. The documents requested here are an important step in understanding the true impact of these proposals. Without this information, we cannot legislate effectively. I have no objections to this substitute amendment as it only makes technical changes to our resolution. However, I certainly hope my colleagues all agree on the importance of our oversight, responsibilities, and will vote to report this favorably to the full House. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. My distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good, do you seek recognition?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes, strike the last word.
Thank you, sir. You know, this new income-driven repayment program would cost approximately $70 billion over 10 years. Of course, I realize that Democrats now spend trillions like it's change in their pockets that they found on the street. So what's $70 billion? My question is, because cost should always be a consideration, is there any limit to what Democrats think we should spend or we can spend? Is there any limit? Do they really believe that spending, deficits, and debt doesn't matter with $31 trillion in national debt? Is there any limit? Kind of like the border invasion. Is there any limit to how many illegals we should let stream across our border? Is there any limit to how much we should spend when we're already bankrupt as a country? Depending on future details of the IDR program, it could add another $450 billion or more. Now we're starting to almost talk about real money here. Plus, the cost of the changes to the public service loan forgiveness could reach nearly $60 billion, depending on the increased participation in the program. And President Biden's waivers for public service loan forgiveness and IDR could result in as much as $145 billion and $211 billion. Together, that's what, $356 billion being transferred from college graduates to hardworking taxpayers. Recent analysis by scholars at my district's University of Virginia found that these waivers made as many as 3.5 million borrowers immediately eligible for the $145 billion in the PSLF. Under current law, even Planned Parenthood employees could be eligible for the public service loan forgiveness, but I guess that's a big bonus to Democrats. But all of this is on top of the nearly $1 trillion in debt that they're already trying to transfer from borrowers to hardworking non-borrower taxpayers with the student loan transfer scheme. Of course, I do believe this is backfiring in a big way with the public who knows it's immoral, recognizes it's unconstitutional, knows it's illegal for the president to try to act alone on this basis. But this, taken together, is just one more example of why the federal government should not be involved in education. Somebody tell me the constitutional basis for the federal government to be involved in education. And if you thought there was some reason to give leeway there, you ought to recognize that they violated any trust we might have had in them, in the federal government, with how we treated children and students over these last 2 years with the China virus situation. We put children last in what we did these last 2 years. We've done irreparable harm from this federal government to children these last 2 years. They will never recover from the 2 years of lost learning. They will never recover from the emotional, mental, and social harm that was done to them as we put the fear of them that they were going to die from a virus they were never at risk of, and we stuck masks on them for 2 years, and now we're trying to force vaccinations on children. That's a violation of the trust placed by the taxpayers in their government, and the federal government has forfeited any right that they didn't have to begin with to be involved in education. But all this together is why we need this oversight And we need this information to hold this administration accountable for the harmful decisions they are making for our children and for our country. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady from South Carolina, Ms. Wilson. I'm sorry, I was told that Representative Wilson wanted to speak.
Mr. Chairman, we did not have Mr. Wilson on our list.
Okay.
I will note
Gentlelady
that,
from Oregon.
I will note that Representative Winstead is here. Finstead is here. I tell him he was welcomed earlier by you very warmly.
Good, thank you. Gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to note that the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program requires 120 payments before the balance is forgiven for people who are working in public service, and that certainly is not retroactive free college, as my colleague has stated, and I yield the balance of my time to Chairman Scott.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to point out that obviously these administration of the programs, if done properly, will cost the federal government more money than if they're administered improperly. Under the former administration, virtually no one was received a discharge after 10 years of public service, even though they were entitled to a discharge. About over 99% of the people that applied for a discharge, thinking they had fulfilled their obligation, were denied. So obviously, if you are running it properly and you're actually doing discharges as people are entitled, it's going to cost some money. And the same with income-driven repayment. In terms of fiscal responsibility, I would just remind all of the members that every Democratic administration since Kennedy every administration has left office with a better deficit situation than they inherited, without exception, every Democrat. And it appears that President Biden is on course to fulfilling that trend. At the same time, every Republican president since Nixon has left office with a worse deficit situation than they inherited. And President Trump was well on his way to fulfilling that trend before the pandemic. And so as we talk about fiscal responsibility and who's spending money responsibly, we just want to point out what every Democratic president has done and what every Republican has done. I yield back to the gentlelady from Oregon.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Gentlelady yields
Chairman,
back.
it's the ranking member. I'd like to move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to take a little umbrage with your comment that in the previous administration, very few people who qualified for PSLF were, quote, entitled to a discharge, end quote, did not get that discharge. I believe the Secretary of Education was being extraordinarily careful to follow the law as it was written. What is happening now is the law is not being followed as it was written, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons we feel so keenly that this is an illegal act on the part of the president. The laws were written all by the Democrats. Republicans commented at the time that these were not well-written laws, very difficult to administer, but they were administered under Republicans as written. And it's troubling to us to hear the accusations continue against the former Secretary of Education in this case. I think the court of public opinion will come out, if not the courts themselves, to show that this was done properly before. And as far as Republicans ending up in more of a deficit than Democrats, we know that the reason we have increased revenue coming into the government right now is because of the Jobs Act and the tax cuts that were implemented under President Trump with the Republican Congress with no votes from Democrats. And so we believe we have created this windfall of money, and I think we need to set the record straight on it. I yield back.
Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams. Could you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. I want to, I'd like to speak briefly again, certainly, let me just yield my time to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. It's interesting that since the tax cut that was referred to, we had the worst recession since Herbert Hoover. So I'm not sure that that was something I'd brag about. But the fact is that 99% of the people that applied for forgiveness under the student loan, public service loan forgiveness program were denied. So I think we can agree on that arithmetic. With that, I yield back. And does the gentlelady yield back?
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Fred Keller from Pennsylvania. I'd like to be recognized.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to set the record straight. We can talk about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It didn't give anybody anything. It took less. It took less from people that work, okay? It didn't transfer things like the scheme the president wants to do, which is outside the law. So we can talk about the worst recession. We can talk about a president that just had a party down on the White House lawn while Americans are suffering under the highest inflation since I've been in 10th grade. Okay, we can talk about a lot of things. What we need to do is be responsible to the people we work for and not redistribute their money to people that did not sign up for the debt. That's what we need to be talking about. We don't pay for anything. The people that get up and go to work every day pay for it. Your salary, my salary, the president's trip to go vote, okay? When he could have done it by mail if he cared about the environment, he'd have done that instead of spending all the time he did in fossil fuels to go and vote. If we want to criticize people's actions, I can certainly sit here and do that. What I want to do is stick up for the people of America that work hard every day and don't expect people to be sticking their hand in their pocket and putting their children farther into debt. If we cared about our children and wanted them to have a better future, we wouldn't be transferring our college debt to them in the form of higher taxes and more deficit spending. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek
Hooray.
recognition? I'm sorry? Anyone else seek recognition? If not, does any member wish to offer an amendment? If not, the debate on the amendment of nature of a substitute is concluded. We will now proceed to the next resolution, House Resolution 1296. Legal authority for student debt forgiveness. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of that amendment. Clerk will designate the resolution.
H.Res. 1296 of inquiry requesting the president and directing the Secretary of Education to transmit respectively certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the legal authority to forgive federal student loan debt.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment in nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.Res. 1296, offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Thank you. Without objection, this amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in nature of a substitute was distributed electronically in advance. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in nature of a substitute. Offer the amendment in nature of a substitute to make a small technical amendment to the bill and to have the debate on the amendment in nature of a substitute. H.Res. 1296 on its face is not a tool of oversight. This resolution is asking for documents relating to the president's legal authority to provide broad-based student debt relief, and it predates the announcement of the one-time student debt relief program by 1 month. The resolution is essentially moot because the Department of Education and the Justice Department published legal memoranda outlining the legal authority and providing the relied upon legal authority with the announcement of the one-time student debt relief program. Now, I understand that the minority does not agree with the memoranda, and during the debate, we're likely to hear mention of earlier memos from the prior administration suggesting that the president does not actually have the authority. These prior memos, as I understand, have been rescinded and superseded by the ones released at the program's announcement. Again, referring to what I said in opening remarks today, just because you do not like or agree the response does not mean that the departments are being unresponsive. H.Res. 1296 does not look for legal authority to the program, but instead makes an expansive and extraordinary request for meetings and everything in the possession of the secretary or the president that mentions debt relief as legal justification of the president's authority to forgive federal student loan debt are already available. So the substance of the request has already been fulfilled, and I therefore oppose the resolution and yield back the balance of my time. Are there any members that seek recognition on the resolution?
Mr. Chairman, Lisa McLean from Michigan would seek recognition.
Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This resolution is about oversight and transparency. The Biden administration's legal authority to enact a mass student loan bailout has been questioned for more than a year. The authority being described as shaky is a major understatement. Quite frankly, it's illegal. Even Speaker Pelosi declared the executive branch does not have the authority to forgive student debt. This administration's justification of its own authority to dissolve student debt is unconvincing. In 2021 memorandum, the Trump administration articulated why no presidential administration had the power to cancel student loan debt. Let me say that again. No administration, including this one, has the authority to cancel student loan debt. This is highway robbery and abuse of taxpayers' dollars, and we must keep this administration accountable. But even before the president charged ahead with this scheme, his administration did not provide any documentation to give insight regarding the decision. I mean, we're talking about a lot of dollars here. The Biden administration is abusing the HEROES Act of 2003, a law meant to extend student loan flexibilities to veterans and military personnel, to enact blanket loan cancellation. The HEROES Act is narrow and highly targeted, as all student loan relief should be. Instead of following its example, the Biden administration is throwing the entire federal student loan system into chaos. That's why H.Res. 1296 requests the Biden administration to transmit all documents and communications related to their so-called legal authority to forgive, which I love that word forgive, because I'm assuming the college professors aren't getting paid on this because we're going to forgive it. But anyways, that's a different comment for a different day. But to forgive their legal authority to forgive student loan debt. The American people being handed this bill is unjust. In a time of skyrocketing inflation, the American people deserve answers. Providing a memo requested repeatedly by members from both sides of the aisle announcing this swindle is not transparency. The American people need and deserve to know who is influencing their government and how it impacts their wallets. This substitute makes minor technical changes, so I have no objections to it. And I hope my colleagues will join me in reporting this resolution favorably. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there others seeking recognition? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word to speak in support of H.R. 1296. A college education has long been seen as the key to economic mobility and the American dream. But as the cost of college grows exponentially, we must also expand our support for current and future students. This crisis includes states represented by many, many members in the minority. According to the Federal Student Loan Portfolio by Borrower Location, FAFSA, North Carolina has 103 million borrowers that have amassed nearly $50 billion. South Carolina has 730,000 borrowers that have amassed over 228 billion. Pennsylvania has 1.8 million borrowers that have amassed over 65 billion. Michigan has 1.4 million borrowers that have amassed over 51 billion. Wisconsin has over 721 million borrowers that have amassed over 23 billion. New York has nearly 2.5 million borrowers that have amassed nearly 94 billion. Georgia has over 1.6 million borrowers that have amassed nearly 70 billion. Indiana has nearly 900 million borrowers that have amassed over 30 billion. Kentucky has over 597 million borrowers that have amassed nearly 20 billion. Idaho has over 217 million borrowers that have amassed over 7 billion. Iowa has nearly 430 million borrowers that have amassed over 13 billion. Utah has over 307 million borrowers that have amassed over 10 billion. Virginia has 1 million borrowers that have amassed 43 billion. Tennessee has nearly 860 million borrowers that have amassed over $31 billion. Illinois has over 1.6 million borrowers that have amassed over $62 billion. California has 3.9 million borrowers that have amassed $146 billion. We must continue to meet this moment with the urgency it deserves. Relieving the burden of student loan provides workers and families the opportunity to build their wealth, plan for the future, and secure their share of the American dream. Last month, President Biden met the moment and announced sweeping action to relieve the burden on student borrowers across our country. Today, I, along with Chairman Scott, will be filing the Lowering Obstacles to Achievement Now, the Loan Act, to lead additional sweeping changes. The Loan Act takes the next step in addressing our student debt crisis by doubling the Pell Grant, improving the public service loan forgiveness program, and by making loans more accessible and less expensive. The Loan Act makes meaningful changes that will benefit both current and our future borrowers. This legislation is a clear next step from the president's executive action to extend further relief to everyday Americans by finally fixing a failed student loan system for our next generation of borrowers. By addressing the issues in our broken loan system, Congress can ensure these systemic issues do not continue to burden our next generation of leaders and America's strong workforce with unsustainable debt loads. This robust action is a move in the right direction towards fixing the higher education system in our country. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute and start to treat these symptoms at their root. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thank you. Just one brief comment on the prior speaker. She mentioned the importance of loan accessibility, implying that the more loans you get, it's better for you. I think a good goal is to go through life without ever having to take out any loans. So it's not, loan accessibility is not always good. Now, I want to talk about not only this program, but just briefly touch upon the public service loan forgiveness. We talk a lot about equality or equity around here. Let's look at what we are doing here as far as the preferred classes and the hated classes who don't benefit from this program. The first thing, we already have debt forgiveness with the public service loan program, which you're not eligible for if you work for the private sector, which is really the sector that makes the country go around. But I always feel in that program, there's a little bit of hatred directed at the manufacturing sector, agriculture sector, retail sector, whatever. You know, we don't treat you as well as if you work for the government. Secondly, I have spent so much of my time on this committee emphasizing the benefit of skills-based education, technical school, because it's you don't have to take out sometimes any loans at all, or much less loans. But here again, these are the people who either going to have to go further in debt because the government's more in debt, or because this is ultimately going to be paid for by inflation, have to pay the higher cost for everything, but they're not the ones who took out the student loans. I really have to speak out and say I object to the idea of putting this additional burden on people who don't go to a four-year college and in essence penalize them, another dislike group. The third group is we're penalizing the hardworking. I know somebody after they went through college not only had their regular job, but worked as an Uber driver and as a bartender. And as the result, he whipped through that student loan really quickly. He was so proud of being hardworking. But in this program, we seem to dislike, almost hate the hardworking who paid off that loan quickly. The fourth class of people I'll talk about is the frugal or less materialistic people. Okay, some people, always like to spend money and pay down their minimum. Some people say, I'm going to defer gratification. I'm not going to spend money on other things. I'm going to pay off that loan. That's another group of people it seems like we don't like in this program. We hate the frugal. And finally, you get a extra student loan forgiveness if you got Pell Grants. I've complained before about the Pell Grants and that they are kind of the middle class, the child of the middle class, particularly married middle class, is seldom eligible for this program. Now, after the child of the middle class is not eligible for Pell Grants, we double the penalty and say that they are not eligible for the double student loan forgiveness. So again, we have the government picking sides, who we like, who we don't like. We don't like the child in the married middle class. If you'll think about it, you could have a married couple in which they're making 180 grand a year, and they get the double loan forgiveness because they got a Pell Grant when they went through college. Somebody else who didn't get a Pell Grant but is making 80 grand a year, they don't get the double forgiveness. So again, we kind of have this dislike for the married middle class that we see so much around here. In any event, whether it's the dislike of the people who don't work for the government, the dislike of the people who didn't go to college, the dislike of the hardworking, the dislike of the frugal, or the dislike of the married middle class, I do not like the way we are picking winners and losers around here, and I wish we'd try to get back to the constitutional way of doing things, which is to say treat everybody equally. In any event, we do ask today for the documents to be submitted, hopefully not so redacted from the Biden administration, so we can really get to the bottom of what this program is about. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we wish you a speedy return. I'd like to strike the last word. I would like to echo my colleagues. I'd like to echo my colleagues on this committee and voice my support for H.Res 1296. The Biden administration has produced one policy disaster after another, but the student loan bailout scheme has to be one of the worst. Let's start with the fact that it's plainly illegal. Congress makes the laws, or at least we should, and in reality, the best loan bailout is a job. The president does not possess the authority to unilaterally cancel loan obligations. Speaker Pelosi argued that very same thing not too long ago, and in due time, I'm confident the courts will agree. Second, it's fiscally irresponsible. Student loan forgiveness is not free. It's a transfer of wealth. This scheme will cost $500 billion and possibly more. It's unfair to force the electrician or truck driver or anyone, to say the least, who didn't go to college to bail out people earning six figures with multiple degrees. Third, it's highly inflationary. As we were reminded this week, inflation remains at a 40-year high. The last thing we should be doing is spending billions we don't have only to make the inflation crisis even worse. Lastly, this scheme does nothing to address the underlying issue that demands our attention, the soaring cost of higher education. And it creates an expectation of additional bailouts down the road. The bottom line is this: the fact that this is not good policy and sets an egregious precedent. It's merely a political ploy just weeks before an election, and there needs to be proper oversight. Passage of this resolution will send a clear signal that the House of Representatives expects full transparency from the administration. And so I urge its passage, and I yield back.
Thank you. My distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to revert back to Mr. Chairman, to your comments in particular about the national debt under Democrat presidents versus Republican presidents. The fact is, the national debt doubled during the Obama administration. Not hard to verify, not hard to confirm. It doubled during the Obama administration, from when he came in to when he left. And then we said that the tax, well, and let me just pause for a second. Are we actually predicting that President Biden is going to spend his way into reducing the national debt? I mean, we're on a record pace now of the national debt increasing halfway through the term, and we're predicting by the end of his term the national debt's going to go down from when he took office. Then we said that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act resulted in the worst recession since Herbert Hoover. There was economic boom during the 4 years of the Trump administration, for the 3 years following the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We have record revenue coming to the Treasury, some $4.1 trillion a year that the IRS is collecting now from hardworking taxpayers, but we want to double the number of IRS agents so we can collect even more. But we just said that the Trump tax cuts resulted in the biggest recession since the Hoover administration. There was no recession during the Trump administration. So I guess we're talking about this recession, which I'm thankful to have Democrats finally acknowledge this recession, defined by two quarters of negative economic numbers. Back to the primary subject today. The Biden administration's decision to transfer student loan debt to taxpayers who didn't borrow the money, it's unfair, it's reckless, It's illegal, it's unconstitutional, and it's clearly harmful to the country. As has already been referenced, the president, his own Secretary of Education, and even the Speaker of the House all acknowledged about a year ago that the president did not have the constitutional authority to transfer student loan debt from borrowers to hardworking taxpayers on his own. The president does not have the authority to increase the national debt by nearly $1 trillion without getting lawmakers in this body to go along with the scheme. We already, by the way, as others have said, have a loan repayment program. My own 3 children are taking advantage of it right now. It's called a job. It works very well. It doesn't cost other non-borrowing taxpayers anything, and it doesn't worsen the $31 trillion in national debt that we already have. But the student loan debt transfer scheme that this administration is trying to ram through unilaterally will cost Americans about $3,000 apiece. This is after Bidenflation is already robbing American families some $8,000 a year in reduced purchasing power compared to 2 years ago. Now think about $8,000 in net purchasing power reduction based on Bidenflation. That means you'd have to earn an additional, say, $12,000, $15,000 a year in gross income to take home $8,000 more in income just to break even to overcome Bidenflation compared to 2 years ago. So we can have another party to celebrate Bidenflation at the White House, but the American people know the truth. They see it every day when they go to the gas pump. The price is posted right there, which, by the way, is double what it was at this time 2 years ago before this president took office, even with the fact that it's trended down a little bit more recently, but is being predicted by his own Treasury Secretary that's going to go up again. But they see it every day at the gas station. They see it every day at the grocery store. They see it when they pay their rent or their mortgage. And they see it when they pay their electric bill, which is only going to get massively worse with this president's war on reliable energy. But welcome to the Biden-Pelosi economy. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Simulski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.Res. 1296. I urge the committee to report the resolution to the full House favorably. Yet again, hardworking Americans are suffering because of the disastrous decisions, by executive order, no less, of this administration. This student loan bailout will cost everyday Americans through increased taxes and the negative effects on inflation that is already at a crisis level. Let's look at the precedent that this program sets. If you're a student today, why not borrow as much as you can if your neighbor is going to pay for it? If you're a college or university, why not increase the cost of a degree if the American worker is ultimately going to foot the bill? And what do we say to people who did everything right and sacrificed and paid their loans back? What's the reward? Pay for the guy down the street that probably got a useless degree? We have a responsibility to the American taxpayers and also a responsibility to fulfill our duties as members of Congress to demand transparency and answers from this administration. There are serious questions regarding the acts of this administration and regarding their illegality and unconstitutionality. I urge my colleagues to join the Republicans in voting to report this resolution favorably. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Harshbarger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Fox. I rise in support of the Ranking Member's resolution of inquiry. You know, the blanket student loan cancellation that the Biden administration is forcing down our taxpayers' throats, not only unconstitutional, but it's incredibly harmful policy. You know, nothing is free. I've said it over and over in this committee. Nothing is free. And despite the rhetoric from the Biden administration and a lot of my Democratic colleagues, the American people are not so easily fooled about who's picking up the check. It's the taxpayers. And most of those taxpayers who never took out a student loan are going to be paying for the decision of the high earning income Americans who chose to take out that student loan. And, you know, it's wrong to force the hardworking people in my district in Tennessee to bear the expense of somebody else's college degree. So I totally look forward to seeing this administration's legal justification for this unconstitutional transfer of wealth from working Americans to college graduates making $100,000. And Secretary Cardona, if you're listening, I know that the Democrats are going to block this resolution of inquiry, but you can expect a subpoena on your desk on January 3rd because the Republican majority next Congress will not tolerate our questions being ignored. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was under the impression that we were here to discuss with this particular resolution the legal activity, or excuse me, the legal authority for the student loan forgiveness program, which somehow devolved into a conversation about gas prices, which tempts me to get into why it's the oil company's fault. But instead, I'm going to yield the balance of my time to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I just wanted to respond to my colleague from Virginia who was commenting on my comment that it was the worst recession since Herbert Hoover. I think he's technically right. It may not have been the worst recession since Herbert Hoover, but it was the worst job results since Herbert Hoover. And I thank him for giving me the opportunity to correct the record. With that, yield back. And gentlelady from Oregon.
I'll yield back as well, Mr. Chairman.
Yields back. Are there others that wish to speak? If not, that concludes the debate on this resolution, and we'll proceed to the final resolution and take up all of them at the end, as previously suggested. House Resolution 1273. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the resolution H.Res. 1273. The clerk will designate the amendment. Will designate the resolution.
H.Res. 1273 of inquiry directing the president to provide certain documents in the president's possession to the House of Representatives relating to communications between the executive branch and the American Federation of Teachers regarding reopening schools and supporting safe in-person learning.
Thank you. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.Res. 1273, offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute was distributed electronically in advance. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute to make a small technical edit to the bill, which will procedurally mean that the debate is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The underlying resolution before us seeks documents in the president's possession relating to communications between the executive branch and the American Federation of Teachers regarding reopening schools and supporting safe in-person learning. Over the last 3 years, the American Federation of Teachers offered numerous proposals on the best way to reopen and keep schools open safely. Moreover, the president of the AFT even pledged $5 million in May of 2021 for the AFT Back to School campaign to return to a 5 days a week in-person instruction. This issue has been litigated and relitigated for years now, but as I said, in multiple hearings we had on the subject of schools during the pandemic, we all wanted the schools to reopen. The academic achievement of students is better when the instruction is in person. They're able to access nutritious meals, and child nutrition is so important. You're unable to fulfill your mental health responsibilities and social interactions if all you're looking at is a screen. You need to be there in person. And finally, you got to be serious. You're not going to open up the economy without opening up the schools. So everybody wants to open the schools. The central question was, how do you do it safely? Obviously, the administration through the CDC and other entities should engage with stakeholders to determine the best practices to safely reopen schools. But if we're looking for White House interference with the CDC, we should be looking at the prior administration where the public record is replete with examples of political interference with the CDC scientific decisions. But all of us know the decisions to close and reopen schools weren't made at the federal level anyway, they're made at the local level. So I ask my colleagues to support the amendment nature substitute and a motion to report the underlying resolution unfavorably to the House so that we can complete our work on these resolutions. I yield back. Are there other members that wish to seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, yes,
gentleman.
Owens, Burgess Owens.
Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to strike the last word. School closures hurt children, period. Knowing the damage and learning loss school closures caused, it is surprising that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC Director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, compromised her integrity and integrity of her agency by changing school reopening guidelines to kowtow to teachers' unions. H.R. 1273 seeks to find out how far Dr. Walensky went to collude with the teachers' unions to keep children locked out of schoolrooms. Teacher unions and the Democratic Party are hopelessly intertwined. Long gone are the days when teacher unions put teachers and students above their own political agenda. Today, these unions are more focused on furthering a radical leftist agenda than bettering our public school education system. As former National Education Association President Lily Garcia said in July 2020, the NEA's core business is not advocating for our members, but to further political stances. The American Federation of Teachers, AFT, is on the same trajectory. In 2020 and 2021, the union published 44 resolutions which demonstrated support for divisive social issues like critical race theory and gender politics. Additionally, AFT has increased its political spending by 400% since 2008, with 99% of these funds going to Democrats. There's no doubt about it. Teachers' unions are beholden to the radical socialist agenda, and Democrats are beholden to teachers' unions. It is these unions that held up school reopenings. To give credence to these anti-science measures, the AFT demanded and got the CDC to change its guidance on school reopenings. This policy change caused immense damage to students. In addition to learning loss, school closures and ensuring social isolation caused substantial mental and emotional trauma to young people. Throughout the pandemic, many reports warned that lockdowns were increasing the rates of depression among young people, but Democrats ignored these warnings and kept schools closed anyway. According to one report, emergency room visits for young girls who attempted suicides were 51% higher in the spring of 2021 than 2019. Let me repeat that. Suicide attempts were 51% higher in spring of 2021 and 2019, and yet Democrats and unions decided to keep schools closed anyway. These kinds of mental health issues don't just go away, they will likely be long-lasting. The American Academic of Pediatrics and the Children's Hospital Association and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry declared adolescents' mental health is a national emergency. Finally, the school closures hurt most the schools that serve minority and low-income communities. According to one estimate, K-12 students who suffered from school closures will lose 3% of their income over their lifetime. These policies are hurting the very communities that Democrats always claim they want to help the most. At least we now know where Democrats' parties lay. And to be honest with you, I've known this where Democrats' parties lay for the last 40 years, and that's why 40 years ago I left the Democratic Party to become a Republican. But we aren't here today merely casting blame. We're here to demand accountability so we can ensure that teachers' unions can never do again what they've done the last 2 years, use federal agencies to hold schools hostage. I don't object to the substitute amendment because it merely makes a technical change to the underlying resolution, but it's imperative that we support this resolution and measure to help us conduct our basic oversight responsibilities. I urge my colleagues to reject the Democrats' efforts to sweep the Biden administration's actions under the rug and instead vote to report the underlying resolution favorable to the House floor. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman recognized for 5 minutes.
First and foremost, I want to show gratitude to the educators, principals, and everyone who works in our public schools and our teachers' unions like the AFT, who have been essential to making the return to in-person learning possible and safe. You all have gone above and beyond for our students and our school communities in unprecedented times. This GOP resolution of inquiry is an unfounded and disrespectful attack on the people who time and again show up for our children, from day to day, teaching to advocate for our schools at every level of government to drive essential resources back home. Let's tell the truth. The AFT and other teachers' unions worked with families and communities to safely reopen schools for in-person learning from the very start of the pandemic. And it's in many ways thanks to the AFT's advocacy that our schools got the American Rescue Plan funding that Congress passed. And let me be clear, without Democratic leadership on the American Rescue Plan, schools would not have been able to reopen safely when they did. The AFT has been clear that in-person learning is essential for supporting students' social and emotional development. Remote learning was necessary in the face of an unprecedented public health emergency. And even then, the unions advocated relentlessly to secure the resources and equipment for students to participate in remote learning from home. Across several town halls, unions took input from families and educators about the challenges of the pandemic. It's logical that the AFT then worked to provide this input to the federal agencies, including the CDC. The AFT and other unions was instrumental in ensuring that reopening plans were actually responsive to the pandemic and in securing the resources our schools needed to actually implement those plans to keep our children and school staff safe and healthy in our classrooms. And let me also say this, I'm the only one on this committee that has worked in education for 20 years. I've been a middle school principal for 10 years. My wife currently is a third grade teacher. So I saw firsthand the impact of this pandemic on our schools and in our school districts. And I saw how smart it was to follow the public health guidelines to ensure that kids would not get sick and kids would not lose their lives, as well as teachers not get sick and lose their lives due to this global pandemic. And let me say again, Democratic leadership on the American Rescue Plan allowed us to reopen schools safely in support of our kids and their ongoing learning. And also these reports that act as if the time that students missed from schools or the times that students spent on remote learning is going to impact their learning for the rest of their lives and their earning opportunities for the rest of their lives. There's no research to support that. That is not how learning works. That is not how cognitive development works at all. The American Rescue Plan resources were specifically designed to address the issue of learning loss, which gives schools and school districts the resources to hire additional teachers, provide summer programmings, provide smaller group instruction, provide more professional development, more curriculum, whatever schools need. So that's not a research-based argument to say that this is going to impact their learning for the rest of their lives or their earnings for the rest of their lives. That's not how learning works. That's not how cognitive development works. And that's not how education works. So that is a false premise to say that that is the case. And let me make one correction. I know Representative Wilson has been an educator her entire life as well. So I know I'm not the only one that has spent my life in education. And also shout out to Ms. Jehanna Hayes, who is another educator on this committee as well as Mark Takano and others. Speak to the educators. We know. We have the experience. We've been in the classrooms. We know what we're talking about. This is not just about talking points. This is our lives. We have the experience. We know what we're talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Miller Meeks.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I speak in support of H.Res. 1273, and I urge the committee to report the resolution to the full House favorably. Not only am I a physician, I am also a former director of the Iowa Department of Public Health, and I have a master's in education. Mr. Chairman, students have suffered since the onset of COVID-19, and much of their suffering was a result of deliberate choices by adults to look out for adults' own interest at the expense of children. I argued this point all the way back to April of 2020. The cost of those choices has been clear for a long time, but it came into even sharper focus this past summer with articles by the New York Times and others. The Department of Education recently released data on September 1st showing that reading and math scores for 9-year-olds declined over the course of the pandemic. Average scores in 2022 declined 5 points in reading and 7 points in math compared to 2020. This is the largest average score decline in reading since 1990 and the first ever decline in math. Other studies have shown long-term negative consequences of these declines. Using data from a 2021 NWE report, Harvard Center for Education Policy Research, those might be experts, estimated such losses would represent $43,800 loss in expected lifetime earnings for each individual student affected. When multiplied by roughly 50 million students enrolled in public schools, that represents about $2 trillion in potential earning losses. Mr. Chairman, the worst part is that none of this is a surprise. We were warned from the very beginning, I was one of those, of the negative consequences that would come from prolonged school closures. We were also warned with evidence that those closures weren't necessary. And we heard from parents at 3 different hearings about the devastating impacts of school closures and their effect on children. And yet the Democrats and their allies didn't seem to care. They didn't listen to the science. They weren't focused first and foremost on the needs of school. And the science showed that in Europe, schools were open. States, such as my state in Iowa, had opened schools in August of 2020 to in-person learning. Mr. Chairman, we know that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention colluded with Randy Reingarten and the American Federation of Teachers on the school reopening guidance that was originally issued soon after the Biden administration took office. We know that collusion had the effect of keeping thousands of schools closed and millions of students stuck at home, worsening the academic and mental health crisis we now face. H.Res. 1273 gives us a chance to make things right. We know that there was collusion between the AFT and the CDC, but the Biden administration has never come fully clean about who was involved in the collusion and the level of influence wielded by the teachers' union. Passage of this resolution will send a clear signal that the House of Representatives expects full transparency from the administration to aid in our oversight duties. We have a responsibility to look into the administration's decisions that have harmed so many students. And let me also remind this committee that we're not only talking about learning loss, we're also talking about the number of youth suicides that forced the Nevada school system to open its schools to in-person learning. Republicans fought for students throughout the pandemic. 5 times during debate on the American Rescue Plan, committee Republicans offered proposals to ensure school districts accepting federal money would keep their doors open or provide parents alternatives and to provide mental health coverage. Unfortunately, each time Democrats opposed our efforts. This resolution gives our Democrat colleagues a chance to begin making things right by joining us and understanding what happened in the administration that led to these decisions. I urge my colleagues to join Republicans in voting to report this resolution favorably, and I yield back.
Thank you. The time has expired. The next is gentleman from my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Democrats in government, not the China virus, crushed small businesses and crushed our economy over these last 2 years. It was government that did that much more than the China virus. And it was Democrats in government who harmed our students and our children these past 2 years with their unjustified and harmful policies, doing irreparable harm to our students. We don't even talk about making up for the 2 years of lost learning. We pretend like it didn't happen, not to mention the damage to the social, mental, and emotional, psychological health of our children that they may never recover from. They'll be harmed for the rest of their lives. This, as my colleague, Ms. Miller-Meek said, this is not a surprise. We said over these last 2 years, in this very committee room and throughout our time in Congress, that the schools should be open, that kids were not at risk from the China virus, that masks made no difference. And yet we still walk around this Capitol complex and see young people, young staffers, I guess they feel like they have to keep their jobs, wearing masks as they walk around when they're not at any risk from this virus. And kids shouldn't have ever been vaccinated because they were not at risk from the virus, and the vaccine itself was shown to be more harmful than the virus was to young children. The CDC said 2 years ago, at the onset of the virus, that it would take $25 billion to safely reopen the schools. But then the teachers' unions colluded with the Biden administration to keep moving the goalposts and delay letting kids back in the classroom, irrespective, again, of the harm, the irreparable harm that was being done. So Democrats here in this Congress joined the Biden administration in giving $200 billion, not the $25 billion that was originally requested, $200 billion to the schools. And yet the teachers' union still didn't want to return to in-person learning. And this very committee, over these last 2 years, refused and rejected Republican amendments that just said, hey, if we're going to give them all this money, let's make them come back to school. Let's make them reopen in person. Let's do what's best for, you know, the children, the kids that we seem to talk about so much in this Congress. Teachers' unions don't have our children at the top of their priority list any more than rail unions have passengers or essential freight at the top of their list. We agree, as one of my friends from the other side just said a few moments ago, we agree that progressive liberal educators are responsible for the problems in our nation's schools. We agree on that. And school lockdowns cost decades of academic progress for our children, particularly for black students, who dropped 13 points in math, the latest numbers show. As a result of the Democrat lockdowns, 9-year-olds suffered a 7-point drop in math scores and a 5-point drop in reading scores compared to 2020. This is the largest decline in over 30 years, all of which is a direct result of the union-encouraged school lockdowns. 9-year-olds lost 20 years of academic progress, meaning children today are posting the same test scores in reading and math as children did 20 years ago. According to one report, also, emergency room visits for young girls for attempted suicides are 51% higher in the spring of 2021 than the same period 2 years ago. Lockdowns and shutdowns and school closures weren't just bad for students academically, they were bad for students' health. But good news, the teachers' unions did just fine. They got paid. They got lots of concessions. They got lots of money for things that had nothing to do with the virus or to improve the school facilities. And they didn't have to go to work every day and teach the kids in person. They did fine. But parents across the country, as they showed in Virginia last November, parents across the country have got the message loud and clear. They have found out what Democrat priorities are. They have found out what teachers' union priorities are, and the jig is up. Teachers' unions do not have the best interest of the students in mind. And again, this is why we need this oversight. And we need this information to hold this administration accountable for these damaging decisions. And I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Students have suffered the most since the onset of COVID, and not from the disease itself, since it poses an extremely low risk of death or hospitalization to children. Most of their suffering is the result of deliberate choices by the Biden administration to reduce in-person interactions among children, which has negatively impacted their neurodevelopment. Our nation's school children have lost years of their education. They've lost their friends, their creativity, and their imagination. They have suffered because Democrats have put their political base in front of the needs of their children, of our children. The Department of Education's own data shows that there's been a steep decline in math and reading scores since 2020. This is why we need to see what coordination existed between the teachers' unions and the Biden administration. Of course, the Biden administration and the House Democrats are stonewalling. What are they hiding? They said there was no communication regarding school reopening. So why can't we see their communications? Today, Democrats on this committee will block our efforts to get answers about why our children suffered for years under their watch. I urge my colleagues to report this resolution out of committee favorably. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to you.
And I yield to Mr. Bowman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Manning. So it's important to note something here. The NAEP scores, the National Assessment Scores that Republicans continue to cite as evidence of a decline in learning based on the coronavirus pandemic and the closing of schools, those NAEP scores were in decline for several years prior to the pandemic. So you cannot talk about test scores at a single point in time on a single assessment as evidence of a decline in learning. You can't, that's number one. Number two, when we talk about student learning, we are not only talking about a singular test score at a single point in time. We are talking about the learning that is happening in classrooms on a daily basis, and that is measured in our classrooms on a daily basis. I want to hear my Republican colleagues also speak about the school districts that did move forward with opening without mask mandates and without the CDC and public health provisions in place, and how many teachers in those school districts actually died as a result of this COVID pandemic because we didn't open safely enough. In my former school, in the Bronx, New York, as schools opened safely without certain tried to open safely without certain guidelines in place, one of the teachers in that school lost his life. He is dead now. He is gone because we didn't have the mask mandates and some of the other states some of the other things we needed to have in place. Let's have honest, open conversations about what the research says about student learning, so that then we can move forward together, Democrats and Republicans, to ensure we are meeting the needs of our students. And then finally, again, the American Rescue Plan provided the resources to school districts across the country that was led by the Biden administration, that was led by Democratic leaders on this committee, and providing the resources to make sure our schools were able to be open safely and to address the issue of learning loss. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Yield back. Ms. Manning, do you yield back?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Then next is the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to echo my colleagues on this committee and voice my support for H.Res. 1273. Throughout the pandemic, we heard that with basic safety precautions, it was safe for children to return to in-class learning. Students not only need in-person learning for educational growth, but also for their emotional, physical, and mental well-being. And virtual schooling is insufficient to meet these critical developmental needs. And if indeed, as my colleagues stated, that there were NAEP scores going down beforehand, that's an indictment of the process as well, and this just made it worse. In fact, many experts continually warned about the long-term costs of keeping schools shuttered that were far greater than that posed by the virus itself. In 2021, a survey of 175 health experts largely agreed that it was safe for students to return to the classroom. One of the respondents to the survey, a pediatric infectious disease expert, concluded, and I quote, "The mental health crisis caused by school closing will be a worse pandemic than COVID," end quote. Sadly, we have seen these warnings come to fruition as emergency departments across the nation report alarming increases in pediatric patients coming to hospitals struggling with mental health. Tragically, the resulting mental health challenges and widening gaps in achievement will be felt for years to come. The Department of Education released data on September 1st showing that reading and math scores for 9-year-olds declined over the course of the pandemic. Additionally, Harvard Center for Education Policy Research estimated that such missed learning would represent a $43,800 loss in expected lifetime earnings for each individual student affected. It did not have to be this way. Sadly, the administration chose to ignore the science and place the political agenda of teachers' unions above the needs of children. And may I state, I talked with numerous classroom teachers who said that they early on needed a kid fix. They wanted to be back in the classroom. This committee has a duty to serve the needs of our nation's students and their parents through proper oversight of the administration. Passage of this resolution will send a clear signal that the House of Representatives expects full transparency from the administration. I urge its passage, and I'm willing to yield to the representative from Utah.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to highlight real quickly, this term of experts has been thrown around, and it seems to be thrown around a lot the last couple of years. My dad was an expert. He got his PhD at Ohio State agronomy, was a teacher, a professor for 40 years. My mother was an expert, a middle school, high school teacher, and that generation of experts led to a community that I came out of, segregated community, that led our country in men matriculating from college. And let me talk about the progressive experts that we're now dealing with across our country for the years that I've watched destroy my community, that great community I just talked about. State of California, a bunch of progressive experts. 2017 came out with a study that 75% of black boys in the state of California could not pass standard reading and writing tests. Right, that's right, cannot read and write. The experts in Baltimore has zero proficiency in math for their youngsters. I lived in New York for a long time. I know what it is to go to Harlem and Bronx. I like to find out what the progressive experts have done to those poor children who don't have a chance to get educated, to learn how to think. We have to get to the point, my friends, where we're not looking at these progressive experts as where we get our directions from. These last 2 years, we're seeing the results of what happens when the Union and Democratic Party collude for their interests instead of the interests of our kids. And it's time for us to be honest about this. It's time to put them as a priority instead of a party or politics or agenda. And let's get honest about how we're gonna help these kids come back. Because right now, they are in a world of hurt because of what we did the last 2 years of putting a politics, and a party as a priority as opposed to our children. With that, I'll yield back. I'll yield back to my colleague. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and I would be willing to yield to Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Dr. Fox for introducing the resolution that we have before us today that directs President Biden to hand over the documents related to coordination of the executive branch and the American Federation of Teachers. Also a member of Judiciary, we had a similar request yesterday that documents be turned over, different type of coordination, but I think it's similar in that it's somewhat troubling that these aren't just offered up. On September 1st, the National Assessment of Education Progress reported on 9-year-olds reading and math achievement. Certainly, I think when you talk to teachers and ask them, it's a pretty simple concept, that they have to somewhat water down the curriculum or simplify the curriculum right now as the kids come back into a full year of school. And the reason for that is, I think, what most of us have experienced over the years, both as kids, as students, and certainly as parents of kids in school, and that is when you have a significant break in the educational process, and the one that we're used to is 2.5 months off every summer, that a lot of kids come back and they've done a complete dump of everything that they had learned the year before. So teachers understand that, and it's kind of a process to get them to once again go back. Not every kid, I would say most kids though, get them back into a mode where they're learning again. Well, you don't have to be a member of Congress to know that what was going on during the pandemic was this shuffle of both parents trying to figure out what to do with their kids all day, and everybody had a different situation. But, and I know often too many times in Congress we're anecdotal with our stories, but I too am married to a person that both was longtime teacher and now a counselor. And what happened was a lot of these kids were, for the most part, unsupervised throughout the day. So there were simply, you know, certain ways of entertaining them. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of kids, it ended up being playing video games all day. So I'd like to get to the bottom of kind of what the information is that we're lacking and what was that discussion. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe we're being suspicious that the teachers, the Federation of Teachers, in good conscience, were actually worried about members, or was there some kind of power play? So I'm not sure why it's so difficult to produce these documents now, or why we can't get our hands on these, just to see kind of what the underlining reasons are that this data is not available, because it could be helpful. I mean, I think that's what many schools are looking for. Certainly that's what many teachers in the classroom are looking for, is just kind of what happened? How did this come about? And if we could get beyond that, maybe we could come up with some good, significant, not only data, like I said, but, you know, some real answers that'll help administrators, that will help parents, and certainly help teachers and kids in the classroom to figure out how we can make sure that this never happens again. It's got to be the most depressing and unnerving part of what happened during the pandemic is what we put our kids through. It's almost somewhat embarrassing that we couldn't look beyond this and see the damage that was going to be done. So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I would support this resolution and would urge that the committee report the bill favorably. Let's not be afraid of what we might actually end up with, because it may be the map. It may be the way that we navigate our way back to making sure that, once again, this never, ever happens again to our kids and to our schools in general. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I rise to support this resolution. You know,
I was recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. In the spring, a great program that has been around for a long time in this area, the Close-Up Foundation. We have groups of high school children come in from our districts, and they spend a number of days in Washington. And one of the things they do is come meet with members. I love meeting with them as a former school board member. And one group from my district, I asked them, usually we do the talking, but I asked them what was their experience with remote learning. And a very impressive group of young people, and they were talking about the pros and cons, some of the things they did like, the flexibility that they had their own schedule and so forth. But one very insightful young man said to me, you know, sir, we are here because we are very good students. That's why we're in this program. But friends of mine, this is the student speaking, friends of mine who I know who schooling does not come easy to, who really need attention from teachers, who maybe don't have a situation that's good, they have suffered immensely. When we went to the hybrid, a lot of the schools went to the 2-day on, 2-day off thing. He said those children, those friends of mine I knew, they did nothing. They learned nothing for 2 days. They languished at home, as Mr. Fitzgerald said, maybe playing a video game. And this went on for a protracted period of time. And if you're telling me that has not impacted the results that we're seeing right now and where kids are at, you know, I think you're delusional. And My colleagues have mentioned studies that are echoing this. They may be denied or refuted, but I think they're matching the reality that we know. My colleagues have mentioned that the largest decline in reading since 1990, the largest decline in math ever. The statistic of a 9-year-old lost 20 years of academic progress. And Harvard, which is quoted quite a bit on the other side of the aisle, has quantified the significant loss in lifetime expected earnings as a result of this significant damage. We have talked about the issue of teen suicides going up. I regret we were going to find a lot of information on child abuse escalating dramatically over this time because these children who are in bad environments, toxic environments, are languishing in homes and never another sight on them from a caring adult. We knew closing schools would have this effect, and we knew we had to follow the science in the reopening of schools safely. We didn't do it. In November of last year, I, along with Ranking Member Fox, led our colleagues in advocating for the implementation of test and stay models in schools to ensure students who were exposed to COVID-19 could remain in class to the safest extent possible. Seems, however, that from the information we have gathered thus far, that not all our leaders in government were basing their decisions solely on the available science. As leaders in education, our mission always needs to be first and foremost providing the highest quality education possible to our students. And that meant in learning, in school learning, which we did not do. If interference from special interests got in the way of that mission, we need to know. I will say one bright spot is parents have seen throughout this nation, which I came to realize serving on the Buffalo School Board, teachers' unions don't represent kids and parents, they represent teachers. And I got news for the teachers. Many of your national teacher union aren't even representing you. They're representing progressive interests, extreme interests that have nothing to do with education. Nothing we do in this committee can make up for the nation's tragic loss of learning. We cannot turn back time on the last 2 years, but we can at least hold our leaders accountable for the actions, and that is why I strongly support this resolution. I allow the rest of my time to Representative Good. Okay. Thank you, sir.
I yield back.
Is Mr. Jacobs yield back?
I do, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is the other gentleman from New York, Mr. Simpliski.
Mr. Chairman, I support H.Res 1273. I urge the committee to report the resolution to the full House favorably. We were told continually to trust the science, put our faith in the CDC. Those who wavered in a little from the talking points of the CDC were regularly mocked and ridiculed. Now, we've learned that helping their friends at the American Federation of Teachers is more important than following the science, and sadly, more important than our children's health and growth. Our school children have had to suffer the consequences of these backroom deals, and that's why I'm demanding transparency from this administration. Those who did this to our children, the mental health crisis and the emotional trauma that has been created by this, they must be held accountable. It breaks my heart to think of the untold lives that have been affected by these dirty deals. As a special needs parent, I'm especially concerned about the vulnerable special education students who were permanently affected. And frankly, I'm flabbergasted to hear from the other side of the aisle that some denials that affecting a child at that stage of development when they're young is somehow not magically going to affect them for the rest of their lives. That just defies belief. I can't believe what I've heard in this hearing. If we don't get the openness and transparency we're demanding, what message does that send to the American people? If we want the American people to trust the CDC, trust the science, trust the government, we have to have answers now. I urge my colleagues to join Republicans in voting to report this resolution favorably, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Keller. You know, we all recognize that facts are hard, and it's embarrassing to have to acknowledge mistakes from the past. I can understand there's so many on the other side of the aisle who are invested in personally on the terrible, harmful decisions that were made over the last 2 years. I understand them not wanting to own that. I'm sure it's frustrating to the Democrats on the other side that as they watched how many of us, let's just be very plain about this, many Republicans, we didn't do anything different over the last 2 years. We operated our offices in person. We didn't require our staffs to wear masks. We didn't require them to get vaccinated or even tell us if they were vaccinated. And yet, what was the difference in the outcome or the results? I'm sure that's been very frustrating for our Democrat friends. It's incredible that we just had a gentleman from New York saying that, talking about teachers who died from reopening. Fact is, there's no proof that anybody died from being out of school. There's no proof of that. There's no evidence of that. That's anecdotal. The fact is, we couldn't prevent Americans from being exposed to the virus. Virus is going to virus. Thankfully, we developed therapeutics and treatments. Thankfully, we had the Trump vaccine that was developed quickly, that was available to those most at risk, those who needed it most. But there was failures that we treated children like senior citizens. We treated college students like those with multiple comorbidity factors. And we fired people for not getting a vaccine, young, healthy first responders and medical workers. And we kicked people out of the military. And yes, we kept our schools closed. And here we just had the gentleman from New York saying, oh, you know, the decline was already happening before this. It didn't get that much worse. Really? Didn't get that much worse. Decline was already happening. Are we trying to say that harm wasn't done academically with the schools being closed for 2 years? Why would we ever go back to in-person learning if that didn't happen? And you think about states like Florida. The courage shown by that governor that the left likes to hate, gosh, but the pesky facts and the pesky results. What state in the country has the highest average age population? And what state in the country was one of the most boldest, courageous in doing the right thing and taking the risk of doing the right thing, which has been validated and proven to be right with what happened? The fact is, the teachers' unions didn't even want to open up after they were prioritized for the vaccine. We moved them to the front of the line for the vaccine, we got them vaccinated, and they still didn't want to reopen. And as far as masks, we brought up masks when one of my colleagues from across the aisle, the mask requirement. We all know the truth on the masks. Why do we even pretend anymore? I know we're invested in what we perpetuated there. We made people wear them on the House floor. We'd be in this committee hearing. We'd have Democrats who weren't in the building. They were afraid to come in the room, and they would fuss at us because we were in here without a mask on. Again, but the pesky results of what happened from that. What happened from that? I visited prestigious medical centers in my district where these chief medical professionals, these surgeons and so forth, we'd have to put our masks on when I visited until we got in the conference room, we sat around the table, and then they took their masks off. That's how much they believed on a personal level in the show, the theater, which was even acknowledged by some of these chief medical personnel in this administration that it was just theater, requiring these cloth masks for these 2 years. Made us feel like we were doing something, I guess. Made us feel like that we cared. Heck, some of the masks even said, oh, I care, that's why I wear the mask. But the fact is, we didn't put the children first. And history will judge us harshly with how we sacrificed our children over these last 2 years on the altar of our political agenda. and the decisions that we made that were at the expense of what was best for our children. And that's why we need this accountability. And I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any others that seek recognition?
Mr. Chair,
I'm sorry.
Representative
seeking
Hayes, I'm in the
recognition?
committee room.
Gentlelady from Connecticut,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add respectfully.
recognized for 5 minutes. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just wanted to add respectfully that as we're talking about how the pesky details of this coronavirus, that we lost 2 members of the Republican conference. So I don't think that the idea that Republicans did nothing or didn't wear masks is something good to tout. We lost 2 sitting members of Congress on your side of the aisle. So I'm glad we did everything we could on this committee to keep members safe for as long as we could. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the debate on this resolution is concluded, and we will return to the first resolution we considered, H.Res. 1295, the PLSF IDR waivers. And the question now occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute as amended. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment nature substitute is agreed to. There being no other members to speak to the bill, I now entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on.
And something that frankly
Just-
looked really,
Just a minute. Is there an objection?
something that looked,
I know what you're talking about. The thing, he gave it to me too.
I'm sorry, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.Res. 1295 unfavorably to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Question now occurs on reporting H.Res. 1295 as amended to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it,
Mr. Chairman, on that, we
And-
request a recorded vote.
and a recorded vote has been requested, and I believe the ranking member has agreed to take the recorded vote en bloc with the other motions reported today. So we will roll that vote and move on to H.Res. 1296. The question now occurs on the amendment nature substitute as amended. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it.
Mr.
and
Chairman, what, ask for, sorry.
This is on the amendment nature substitute. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment of nature of a substitute is agreed to. There being no other members to speak to the bill, I now entertain a motion on the bill and recognize the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.Res. 1296 unfavorably to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Question now occurs on reporting H.Res. 1296 is amended to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. All in favor of that motion will say aye.
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 All opposed, no.
No.
No, the ayes appear to have it.
Mr.
Gentlelady
Chairman,
from North
that
Carolina.
request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested, and that too will be rolled and voted en bloc. H.Res. 1273, the CDC AFT school reopening guidance. The question now occurs, the amendment nature substitute is amended. All in favor of the amendment in nature of a substitute will say aye.
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 All opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. There being no other members to speak to the resolution, I entertain a motion to report the resolution and recognize the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.Res. 1273 unfavorably to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Question now occurs on reporting H.Res. 1273 as amended to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. All in favor will say aye.
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 All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
I'd ask for a recorded
And
vote,
the
Mr. Chairman.
Recorded vote is requested. We will now take, without objection, we will now take one recorded vote on the motions to report out H.Res. 1295, H.Res. 1296, and H.Res. 1273, all as amended and all with an unfavorable rating. The vote, again, will be reporting all three bills. Are we ready for the vote? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney.
Aye.
Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sublime.
Aye.
Mr. Sublime votes aye. Ms. Wilson.
Ms. Wilson votes aye.
Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano.
Takano votes aye.
Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross.
Norcross votes aye.
Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild.
Wild votes aye.
Ms. Wild votes aye. Mrs. McBath.
McBath votes aye.
Mrs. McBath votes aye. Mrs. Hayes.
Hayes votes aye.
Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Mr. Levin.
Aye.
Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar. Ms. Stevens.
Ms. Stevens votes aye.
Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Leisure Fernandez.
Leisure Fernandez votes aye.
Ms. Leisure Fernandez votes aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Ms. Manning.
Manning votes aye.
Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan.
Mervan votes aye.
Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman.
Mr. Bowman votes aye.
Mr. Bowman votes aye. Mrs. Sheriff-Phyllis McCormick.
Sheriff-Phyllis McCormick votes aye.
Mrs. Sheriff-Phyllis McCormick votes aye. Mr. Pocan.
Pocan votes aye.
Mr. Pocan votes aye. Mr. Castro.
Castro, aye.
Mr. Castro votes aye. Ms. Sherrill.
Cheryl votes aye.
Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Espaillat.
Espaillat, aye.
Mr. Espaillat votes aye. Mr. Mfume. Mr. Mfume. Ranking Member Fox.
Fox votes no.
Ranking Member Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Wahlberg.
Nay.
Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman.
No.
Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik.
Stefanik votes no.
Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen.
Allen votes no.
Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks.
Banks votes no.
Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer. Mr. Fulcher.
Folgers, no.
Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller votes no. Mrs. Miller Meeks.
Miller Meeks, no.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good.
Mr. Good votes no and looks forward to revisiting this in January.
Mr. Good votes no. Mrs. McLean?
McLean votes no.
Mrs. McLean votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes no.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mrs. Miller?
Miller is no.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mrs. Sparks? Mrs. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Cawthorn? Mr. Cawthorn? Mrs. Steele?
Still votes no.
Mrs. Steele votes no. Mr. Jacobs? Mr. Jacobs votes no. Mr. Finstad?
No.
Mr. Finstead votes no. Mr. Sempolinski?
Sempolinski, no.
Mr. Sempolinski votes no. Mr. Grijalva?
Grijalva votes yes.
Mr. Grijalva votes yes. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar? Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones? Mr. Mfume? Mr. Mfume? Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Mr. Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer? Mrs. Sparks? Mrs. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald?
No.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. And Mr. Cawthorn? Mr. Cawthorn?
How is Ms. Omar recorded?
Ms. Omar is not recorded, sir.
I vote yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Ms. Omar votes yes.
Can you please call the members who have not voted one more time?
Yes, sir. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones? Mr. Mfume? Mr. Mfume? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer?
Okay.
Mrs. Sparks? Mrs. Sparks? And Mr. Cawthorn? Mr. Cawthorn?
How is Mr. Jones recorded?
Mr. Jones is not recorded, sir.
Jones votes aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Mr. Chairman, the clerk is ready to report.
How's Mr. Mfume recorded?
Mr. Mfume is not recorded, sir.
Mr. Chairman, my vote is aye.
Thank you.
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 28 ayes and 21 noes.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Yes, sir. For this vote, there are 28 ayes and 21 noes.
28 ayes, 21 noes. The ayes have it. And the resolutions are reported unfavorably. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills as amended. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice to all members they have the requisite number of days of House supplemental minority additional dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, any members who wish to insert materials into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. Is there any further business to come before the committee? If not, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank everyone for their cooperation.